And good morning and welcome to OpenLine online stream. It is Sunday, December 8th, and we are live, and definitely someone has their volume up on their telephone this morning.
We won't say it was Bobby Charles.
No, we will not say that it was Bobby Childs this morning.
It was me.
Good morning, folks, and welcome to, like I said, the OpenLine online stream. We have a lot of news to talk about, and so let's introduce our panel. We have our regular crew in today. We have our journalist, Nitha Khan. Good morning, Sister Nitha.
Good morning. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Morning, sister.
Good morning, Sister Nitha. Both sports brothers are in. Bobby Childs, good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be here, family. Thanks for tuning in this chilly Sunday morning in New York City. And hopefully those of you who are outside of New York City, it is less chilly out there.
There you go. We have New York, Amsterdam sports writer, Jamie Harris. Good morning, Jamie.
Good morning, brother. How are you? And good morning to all our viewers out there.
Sounds good. And we have, of course, legal analyst, former judge, attorney Bob Pickett. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning for team, and good morning to all the good folks.
All right.
Here today.
Good morning, Judge.
And we have our brother activists, brother protests. And I'm talking about
Brother protest.
that brother that is out there on the front line, and he is bringing the noise. And that is our good brother, Larry Ham. Good morning. Get that mic there, my brother.
Good morning. How's everybody?
All right.
Everybody's doing well.
You do know in the sports world, right, when they announce the starting lineup, the last person to come in, that's the go-to person.
Oh, really?
You are our go-to person.
There you go.
That's it.
And you know, and he
scared.
just coined a new term, and it's kind of serendipitous, but he's that brother.
That brother.
That brother.
Oh boy,
I like
I'm
that.
scared now.
So what so many news stories out there. So I'm just going to start. Here we go again. We had two shootings this past week. It's to the point that these shootings are happening, and you hear about it, and then the next day something else happens in the news, and if you're not involved with the shootings, it's just to the point that people just go on about their business. 3 people were killed and multiple others were injured, including 2 sheriff deputies in the shooting at the naval base in Pensacola, Florida, this past Friday morning. There was also a second shooting that took place last week, and that was at the U.S. military facility Wednesday, where a sailor was fatally shot and 2 civilians in the Defense Department were, and this took place at the Pearl Harbor facility. And I'll start with you, Brother Larry. Here we go again. Nothing about gun control, and how are these guns getting places where they don't even supposed to be?
Well, this is more serious. I mean, it is part of the gun control discussion, but it's more serious than that. It's really a question of national security. The question of how did this person who was from Saudi Arabia, obviously from an elite unit in Saudi Arabia, if in fact he's here training with the United States, how did this person get past all the vetting, get into the service here, and in fact was able, the real question is up front, how did it happen that he was able to get from there to here? Because once he got in, to carry that out was just a matter of fact. The question is, how did that happen? And really what's disappointing in all of this, the person who could really set the narrative for this is Donald Trump. And Trump's first instinctive reaction was to protect the Saudis.
Right.
To protect these people who murdered and naturalized American citizen, Khashoggi.
Yeah.
The journalist. And so Trump, is saying, well, I've talked to the king and everything is going to be all right and the king is concerned. I don't want to sound, xenophobic, but I mean, as soon as this happened, it caused me to reflect back to 9/11. And we have to remember that the majority of the hijackers involved in 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. This person was from Saudi Arabia. Another interesting thing, a parallel, I don't know if it's exactly the same, is that I understand that they were looking at films of mass shootings the night before he carried this shooting out.
He supposedly had like a dinner party
Right.
or something.
And
where they
remember,
watched
the
it.
hijackers in 9/11 went partying the night before that they carried out their
And they
incident.
had also visited New York City as well.
I think that we need to reassess our relationship to Saudi Arabia. That it's obviously not what they're telling us it is. They kill people with impunity. They're a feudal dictatorial regime. You know, it's just, to me, it's out of control, and they're being protected by Donald Trump.
You know, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I agree, Larry. So it's a couple things. Like on the one hand, I worry about the xenophobia aspect of it, right? Where all Muslims get lumped into it and everybody gets thrown under the bus. But I do agree with Larry that we absolutely do need to look at our relationship with Saudi. And it was interesting to me that when it was it was December of 2015 when the San Bernardino shootings happened. And that's when Donald Trump came out with his total, he wanted a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country. And that's what actually sadly propelled him to another level. And then remember, millions of people voted for him. And then he was able to get this Muslim ban, a version of the Muslim ban upheld by the Supreme Court. So it's interesting that is his response to a tragedy in 2015. And now, because it is Saudi Arabia, this is his response. The way he came out immediately defending King Salman, defending MBS, defending Saudi Arabia. And you have to look at financial interests, and you have to look at even our military interests in terms of supplying Saudi Arabia, what they're doing in Yemen. Like Larry said, the killing of Khashoggi, all of this goes into it. But I just always, like, as a Muslim American, I do always worry about the backlash against all Muslims as well, too, because one of the victims in this shooting was a young Muslim kid who, I believe he was 19 years old, and he actually tried to stop this guy, and he was killed. So all of that, like, I think it's important because immediately there are a bunch of people on TV talking, a bunch of anti-Muslim stuff right away. So that part of it, I think we need to be aware of, but still being able to criticize the regime in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, this regime, and Nitha, you talked about it, right, the financial side. So it goes beyond just Trump, right? So they have been trying, MBS has been trying to further develop that country financially. And so they have a business development fund out there that's going around the world trying to do different things to attract different companies to come invest in Saudi Arabia. They are one of the biggest investors right now. They have a partnership with SoftBank in Silicon Valley, and they are trying to entice. And they had a conference earlier this year that right after the Khashoggi one, it almost got canceled, and a lot of companies took a lot of criticism if they were to attend. So a lot of American companies just backed out of it. But then, slowly but surely, those conversations continue. Yesterday, Saudi Arabia had hosted a heavyweight fight. Anthony Ruiz Jr. and Joshua, and there's a rematch fight out there. And what struck me, what a lot of people talking about, is like, well, it was a good fight to watch, but the time difference, because you're watching a fight at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But it just struck me right on the heels of this shooting. You can just see how they're continuing to try to drive more financial acceptance out there and doing this investment, because they put on a big spectacle in the desert for this heavyweight fight, which was a decent fight out there. So, MBS, he has a challenge out here, right? On one hand, he's saying that he's trying to become a much more accepting, progressive society, and that he has these factions that are still permeating, these religious zealots who want to do things. And as you talked about, Larry, this report that they were celebrating or watching these videos the night before they did it, and it sort of plays into, if you're going to go to the afterlife with the seven brides or whatever their belief is, that they're gonna. It's
not even really a belief, but
no, I'm just saying. I mean, like these are the things that they, when they commit these acts and they believe they're doing it on behalf of of religion, and they're going to go to this afterlife and be rewarded with all these other things. It is troubling. And your point, Larry, is like, how did he get vetted out of Saudi Arabia? So it's not just the United States not vetting him, but Saudi Arabia didn't vet him. And this is someone who was a member of their military who came from their country. They vetted him, they approved him for joint training, and this is what resulted.
Well, each of you made great points. Just from a geopolitical standpoint and also a global economic standpoint, Saudi Arabia is a very significant and very critical, country. And, Trump has stated, I mean, unabashedly that, listen, they're buying, hundreds of millions of dollars in military equipment for us. So for him, not only from a standpoint of the United States, but also personally, because we know Trump looks at everything through the prism of how does this benefit him personally, or benefit those that are close to him personally, financially, of course. And so we've seen a long list of egregious acts and behaviors by Saudi. You mentioned Khashoggi, since the contest on Yemen. That's the greatest humanitarian crisis still in the world today. Absolutely. And they are solely responsible for that. Absolutely. And the United States and this administration has remained silent, on that issue. And so
we're supplying the weaponry.
Absolutely.
Right. And
Absolutely.
this weaponry, you think about it, this Ukrainian, right? So he's holding up aid to the Ukraine against Russia, but freely continuing to allow arms that Saudi Arabia can buy.
Yes, correct. yes. And Larry, you started when we look at and Iran is commonly viewed as the country that is state-sponsoring terrorism. Right. Well, no one has sponsored terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism more than Saudi Arabia. Right. I mean, let's be clear about this. Right. And so, again, and I think, Bobby, you pointed this out, Larry, not just the Trump administration, but past administrations have been very nuanced and certainly very careful in how they will criticize Saudi Arabia. And not only just public criticism, but what actions are taken against them to stop them from carrying out this behavior. And so I do think that is a sphere. And don't forget, for many, Saudi is looked at as an ally to Israel, which is very important as well in the Middle East. And so you just have, this nexus and these connections. And again, from a geopolitical standpoint, it's a country that no one really wants to just go hard after and call them for what they are. And the prince, listen, this guy he's horrible. Mm-hmm. And Trump again has allowed him to have some type of legitimacy. Yeah. And right now he should not be legitimized for what he's done.
Talking about that, right? So I know we'll get to this later on, but you had the issue in NATO, right? And so NATO is about how do you get all, reconnect with your allies for a common purpose. He's actually creating a different set of allies. Right. Saudi Arabia, North Korea he tried, right? Russia he's been doing. Yeah. So he is trying
Duarte in the Philippines,
right,
strong.
He's trying to create a different set of allies and pissing off all the other established allies, which to me, and we said this, when he first was elected, he is going to do more damage to the country than any other president in the history of being a president out there. And you see it time and time again. His quick defense of Saudi Arabia. Now, if that was a Ukrainian who did that, he would have slammed them because it fit his narrative.
Or any other Muslim country.
Exactly, right?
Yeah,
but
they would have been
Saudi
on the
Arabia,
ban.
His first thing was to defend.
Of course.
Right,
I was just going to say, remember, as president, the first country he visited overseas was Saudi Arabia.
Right. And they put on this grand show for him. And,
the orb and all that nonsense that went on.
Well, we should demand full transparency. My fear is that the Trump administration, the Justice Department, and perhaps even some of our intelligence agencies will try to cover up aspects of the investigation of this. Perhaps even the Army, because the Army, they're on the hook now because they're going, well, who let this guy in?
The Navy,
the Navy, excuse me. Who let this guy in? So I think that people should be demanding full transparency and all the facts into the investigation of this shooting, because a pattern is emerging here with Saudi Arabia. This is a pattern. And remember how George Bush came to the rescue of the Saudis when
Absolutely. 9/11.
9/11,
Safe
when-
passage out of the country.
when all the planes were down.
Absolutely.
They let the Saudis fly out
Yeah.
of the United
Absolutely.
States. That's
Absolutely.
crazy.
Yeah.
You know,
and like you said, 15 of the hijackers were from Saudi.
15 of the hijackers. The Senate passed a resolution calling for an end to the war on Yemen. The president has ignored the resolution that's passed by the Senate. You know, we have to rein in. And then another aspect of this, Jamie raises a question of why other administrations have been turning the blind eye to Saudi Arabia. We need to know, we talk about Russian influence in our elections. How much money has Saudi Arabia put into our elections? I mean, this is something, because I would bet that it's money equal to or surpassing the amount of money that the Russians have put into our
I
elections.
agree. That's very interesting. You know, as Bobby Charles has said, and we're going to piggyback into that, but I just want to mention one thing that also took place this week, was that President Trump asked the Supreme Court on Friday to put a hold on the House subpoenas requesting his financial documents from two banks in his latest case dealing with his personal finances. And of course, the Supreme Court did that. They basically put a hold on it, and the stay is ordered until 5 p.m. on December 13th, and the Supreme Court ordered that a response must be filed on or before December 11th by 11 a.m. So we'll see where that goes. But
but so far the game plan and the way things has played out is the subpoenas, they get reviewed at the lower courts. The lower court said you have to release, and then Trump's lawyers, they go and appeal it, and it's a delaying tactic, right? So now they get it to the Supreme Court. This is going to be the last delay, because I don't see anything different, and I don't believe the Supreme Court's going to hear anything different than what's been presented before. The excuse or the defense that his lawyers are putting forth is that the request is too broad and that they want to go back too far. But the reason they want this is to understand a couple of things, right? On one hand, they're looking at it to see in New York State whether he has campaign financing. So they need to see it. Congress is looking at it to make sure that he's not compromised in a conflict of interest. And given the evidence that's out there, I can't see how a court could say you're too broad. So they're asking for a decade's worth of information. So that is a combination of pre-presidency and some presidency. And remember, when he was running, one of the major lies he told was, I would love to release it, but I'm being audited, which is not true, right? And so now their defense is going to be, well, it's too broad, so you shouldn't get anything. And I can see, the Democrats' lawyers putting together and to say, so what is it? Is it too broad, or is he being audited? But it's a delaying tactic, and he has to share something out there. So, and it's funny how conservative media has picked up on it. So the headlines have been reading, Ruth Ginsburg puts a hold on the release.
Correct.
Right? Not the Supreme Court.
Ruth Ginsburg.
She was the lead on this one, so they credit her with it to try to say, look, the Supreme Court, Ruth Ginsburg, who's been, we were all suspect with, she's even siding with the president, which is just another false narrative that conservative media is putting out.
Well, I think optically and substantively, that's his biggest fear of having his finances exposed, because it would prove that he's a fraud. I think we all know that, he's, certainly has filed for bankruptcy on many occasions.
times.
And where he's getting his money from at a time where no Western financial institution would lend him money,
There you go.
it is also of a concern to him. So that would be exposed. And as Bobby pointed out, the campaign finance. I mean, Michael Cohen essentially said he's committed all type of campaign finance violations. And so this is why, going back to McConnell, and Larry has said this many times, McConnell's only agenda was stacking the courts, which they've done.
Right.
And which they continue to do. That was McConnell's agenda. That was the mandate. That was a true mandate. It really wasn't the wall. This was, all spectacle. It was to rile up his base and to really make this visceral connection to those that bought into his bigoted, racist, rhetoric.
Right.
But the real agenda was to stack those courts. And he's really been able to reshape the Supreme Court. They're hoping that Ginsburg ultimately steps aside before, his term is up. McConnell's already said, although he blocked Obama from having Merrick Garland have a hearing, he's already said, hey, we're certainly, in the last year of Trump's presidency, we're going to nominate another judge and have that judge at hearing. And
not only the Supreme Court, all the circuit courts.
all the circuit courts, absolutely. And they've been, and just this week, they've nominated, several judges who've never tried a case, who have essentially never written briefs. They've just clerked, for Supreme Court or other federal judges on the appellate court, but they are totally unqualified. And what's scary about that also is...
I want to ask Bob Pickett, how dangerous is that, Bob?
No, that is extremely dangerous to have people in a particular sector of the court process who have no background and no significant training. It bothers me a great deal that they've gone in that direction.
And they're all young. They're all in their 40s and early 50s. So they're going to be on the courts 35, 40 years. Those are lifetime appointments. And so, again, going back to, the financial records. So, again, he's attempted to stack the courts hoping that as the process moves up, ultimately to the Supreme Court, that they will rule in his favor. Because he knows that, to use an old term, the jig is up then. Right. Once those records are made public.
Right. And you said fraudulent. He's a fraud. You might also find some fraudulent activity.
Absolutely.
There. So we have to watch that. But
well, one of the things that's been is going to be real clear is he's not worth as much money as he's ever claimed.
I was going to say, you mean not a billionaire?
That's the opposite.
So put aside the conflict of interest, because we know his vanity. The fact that if it gets released and it shows truly what his net worth is or was, it then is like, those are the facts. You're not this multi-billionaire,
great deal maker,
right? You're getting like pennies on the dollar out there. So that will be a blow to his ego. And then you'll see the conflict of interest to understand his sources, which will give them more leads to understand who's financing, right? And we've said this on the show many times. There's a strong belief that when he lost the casinos, none of the banks would loan him money except for Barclays, and they're under a lot of Deutsche Bank, and they're under a lot of scrutiny for it. And there was belief that he was getting his money from Russians.
Well,
not only scrutiny, but interestingly, one of the bank officers that signed off on Trump's loans committed suicide.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Following the alleged suicide of Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
Alleged.
And now 2 security guards.
The correction officers.
being used as
the fall guys
scapegoats.
as scapegoats.
Are going on trial, have been indicted, right?
Yeah. So, you go back to that time period, right, when in Trump Tower, it's been reported over and over again that he had Russian mob members, oligarchs, who were running a poker game out of Trump Tower, high-stakes poker game, where reported that Alex Rodriguez was playing in there, Leonardo DiCaprio, that they had all these celebrities going in. It was well known in New York City that he had these high rollers that the Russian mob were hosting these games in his tower. So when he talks about, I'm worried about corruption in Ukraine, and you know his history, you know he's full of crap.
Wow. You know, this is interesting. I'm sitting here. I got to be, very careful because everything is allegedly, But now I'm starting to connect the dots. I'm starting to connect the dots on something, and the reason why, because I was asked to do. Whoa, I was asked to do something.
Do some security for them?
No. I was asked to do something where
That's
I
a
was
very-
approached by somebody who was Russian. I'm not, and was asked to do something. They wanted to know a little bit more what I did in radio, and that they wanted to put money behind probably some type of sponsored radio program. Didn't follow through with that, but this was about at least 5 years ago. And then to piggyback off of that, I noticed that the same individuals were involved in housing, especially out in Queens. So now when you say about this poker game, I'm saying, wait a minute here. This is serious, because the Russians honestly have their hands in more.
Was the guy's name Lev Parnas?
No, that name wasn't mentioned. That name wasn't mentioned. But on the serious side, you gotta see that the Russians are really knee deep in a lot of things connected here in the United States. It's deeper than I think that's out.
And, well,
And
you
it's
know,
very
Well,
dangerous.
at least Fatine isn't like Devin Nunes. He can remember the conversation. He can't remember the conversation with partners.
I don't remember. I've talked to a lot of people. I don't remember.
well, let's throw some more innuendo on this this fire out there, right?
Yes.
So you go back to that time period, right? Who was the mayor of New York? Rudy Giuliani. Now, what was Rudy's claim to fame?
Yes.
Cleaning up crime.
Yes.
But the crime he went after were the Italian mobs.
He did that as an attorney.
Right.
That was a U.S. attorney, Southern District.
There is reports out there that he did that to make it easier for the other mob to come in, the Russian mob.
You get the bell.
There you go.
Bobby
Well,
gets the
baby.
bell on that one.
That's interesting.
You mean
I'm just gonna
Giuliani,
watch
the one
this.
who's making a documentary supposedly
Yes.
now in
Yeah.
Ukraine or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So, as Bobby has stated earlier, I'm going to throw it over to Bobby. Also this week, we saw where President Trump was in the UK for the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization's 70th anniversary meeting, which is also known as NATO. And you saw President Trump abruptly cancel his NATO news conference after the summit turned sour. Bobby, why don't you update our audience on what took place and how it turned sour?
Well, before I get to the sour, right? So the impeachment's going on here, and he's been invited numerous times to participate in the impeachment hearings. He said that he wants to do it, but he's too busy. One of the things he was too busy with was he had to go to NATO. He goes to NATO, but then, as you pointed out, he left NATO early. So again, how busy are you? So he went there. Everyone was worried that he was going to pull out of NATO. So you had a lot of the other, country leaders who had talking points to rebut or to respond to the unknown that he may have played out. And he actually changed up on him because French leader Macron actually was the one who was a bit critical to NATO. And then Trump sort of defended and said, well, that wasn't a nice thing to say, when he said 10 times worse about NATO out there. So,
And also they had a little, when they did that, it's not like a presser, but when they're sitting down talking to each other, and Trump, sorry, my voice, Trump said something about ISIS fighters and, I can give them to you or whatever.
Right.
And then Macron was like, can we be serious, please? Can we have a moment and be serious? And he basically shut him down on the world stage. I mean, it was so embarrassing.
and that was the big thing that led to things going sour, right? Which is all the world leaders now are not trying to placate him. They are treating him the same way a lot of us treat him, which is he's a clown. And so they got caught on video, Boris Johnson, Trudeau, sitting around, and Macron and Trudeau and Merkel. But Trudeau said, basically talked about how, everything is late because he does these unprecedented. He can't stick to the script, and his staff was like, they were horrified that he just kept going on. So basically saying how things are late, and the overrun of the Trump press conference ate into some of Trudeau's time. So that's why Trudeau made the comments that he did. So it gets caught on a hot mic. It goes viral. And Trump's response was, he's two-faced, that Trudeau's two-faced. That's like...
And then he goes home.
And then he went home.
He didn't have his closing press
Right.
conference, jumped on Air Force One,
Right.
and came home.
Like a little baby.
And then you saw that last night. If you saw Saturday Night Live, they played that.
If
pretty
it
much.
wasn't so serious, it would be comical.
Right.
Yeah.
And in the micro sense, it is a moment of tragic comedy. But on the world scale, this is a very serious problem because our allies do not have confidence in the United States. More so than the lack of confidence of the allies is the fact that Russia and China are gaining on the world stage. Now, I'm not saying this in the Cold War sense. I'm saying it in the sense of international politics, that more and more countries are moving away from reliance on the United States and entering into agreements with Russia and China for their economic and military considerations.
I'll give you a couple examples to validate that even more. So in Africa, the Russians are in there doing military maneuvers in different parts of Africa, and the Africans are very appreciative of it because the United States, which they've asked in the past, never really did anything for them.
Well, they're training them, and they're also, without question, flooding Africa with hundreds of millions of dollars in resources. But they're also, on the flip side, and this is the quid pro quo, they're taking full control of many of the natural resources that are in Africa.
And so China's doing, even on a bigger scale in Africa, less on the military training,
Infrastructure.
but more on infrastructure.
Absolutely.
So China and Japan are in there. Over the Thanksgiving break, so don't hate, I got a chance to go to
I gotta be
Grenada
hated.
because I went to Grenada. Go ahead, say something, right?
I'm not saying anything.
I went to Grenada, and it was the first time I was there. It was a beautiful country, but just talking to the locals there and just driving around, I'm watching a whole bunch of Chinese companies in Grenada. Infrastructure.
Yeah.
So China is going around the world, Larry, investing from an infrastructure side so they can get control of the resources.
Yes.
Russia's going around providing military support so that they can get a foothold in there. And our president, the president of this country, is sitting around having temper tantrums and talking about how to make America great when he is basically, the world leaders are saying, I don't have to worry about him. I don't need to kiss his behind. And we're going to do what we want to do. And the disappointment, and you point out, Larry, the disappointment is that they knew he was so-so. They thought the rest of the country could manage him so he wouldn't get any worse. And he's actually gotten worse because Congress has been stonewalled into taking action. His own party has been silent upon it, and that empowers him to act more out of control than he's ever done before.
And his default when he's called out on, not really coming to the table and presenting any solutions or being able to talk in depth and profoundly about some of the, critical issues facing NATO is, well, I'm getting them to pay their fair share. He repeatedly says that because he has no grasp or no clue about the critical issues that NATO is facing. As you just pointed out, Bobby and Larry, the rise of Russia and China globally in places like Africa. And now we're talking about Central and South America. And so, as you said, they're moving away, from the United States because of him. And what they're doing is, and I assure you that as the years go by, we will hear about this. There's back channel discussions, between the intelligence agencies, between some of these other, very critical and certainly far more important and weighty institutions here in the United States. They're having discussions with them without Trump being involved.
And remember,
because the United States is still very much involved in those issues, but they're just not going through him.
Just remember two other things to remember, right? So back in the 60s, we had the issue, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Who was connected there? Russia, right?
Yep.
So they've been trying to get in that foothold in the Caribbean and South America. The other thing around that was, just ran out of my head.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, with respect to Russia and China, Larry sort of alluded to this earlier too, that there are dictatorial, strongmen that are running those countries. Like you look at Xi, who's in power indefinitely now, right? And then you have millions of Uyghur Muslims that are in detention/concentration camps. The crackdown on Hong Kong protesters. So you have these like extreme strong men who are amassing more and more power and cracking down on freedoms at the same time while all of this is happening.
Yeah, let's talk about this. Let me just say this real quick. The United States had this whole thing that they were policing the world at one time. And now, as you say, that to me, it's like the rest of the countries are starting to close in on the United States. Those that are not allies to the United States, those that hated the United States, as you and Bobby stated, how these other countries are getting footholds in different directions, the Soviets, the Asian, China, and all of this, to the point that it seems like the United States and Israel may be to the point that the bullseye may be on their backs. These countries may move on them one day. Don't think that they will not. I know that we're a superpower, but don't think that these nations will not come together and move on the United States and Israel.
I think it's important to see this not just as the product of Trump's idiosyncrasies, but also to see this as a policy outcome. When Trump became president, he explicitly said he was following the path of nationalism. Now, this contradiction between a nationalist perspective and an internationalist perspective goes. You see it throughout American history. We would have to go back to the 19th century, but the fact of the matter is that he came in with a philosophy embodied in his policy that the United States was not going to see itself as an arbiter in world affairs, and that he was telling the world not only should the U.S. do this, but other countries should do this too. The reality is that we're all interconnected, that nationalism, and one of the things we have to keep in mind, nationalism is one of the legs upon which fascism stands. And Trump is now moving to really, what's coming into being is a new fascist axis. The countries that you talked about, Israel and Saudi Arabia and Bolsonaro in Brazil and this other one in Poland. Orban in Poland. These are all right-wing governments. And what the disorder that we see in the world today has a lot to do with this new configuration that's coming to being.
And I remember what the other point was that you just triggered it, Larry. No one's going to listen to the United States because there's no one to talk to, because he has not filled all the ambassador jobs. He has a ton of openings in the State Department. So where you would have diplomacy listening posts, they don't exist. And where you do have it, I'm sorry, he has people in there like Gordon Sunderland. He has people in there who are not trained diplomats. And so you become a joke, not just with him, but his administration and as a result.
You're
the
not
entire
talking about
company.
the Sunderland who spoke to the president on an
On
unsecured
unsecure
line
phone.
in a restaurant.
Multiple times.
Multiple
Yes.
And let's say this: there's still no record of the alleged conversation where Trump said no quid pro quo, and that conversation allegedly took place well after Trump knew that they were about to be investigated, using the same language that had already been out there in regard to what he did and his actions on those phone calls.
Right. Also this week, we also saw the impeachment hearings that had taken place. And first that we saw Wednesday where there were 4 scholars that went before the hearing, and 3 of them were invited by the Democratic side, and 1 was by the Republican side.
Constitutional scholars.
Exactly. And the Republican side, of course, pretty much was basically saying that there was no grounds for impeachment on the charges that were brought, versus the other 3 scholars.
Yeah, it was Jonathan Turley for the Republicans.
Exactly. That everything that the House brought against President Trump are impeachable offenses. And they are looking at the offenses as the 3: abuse of power and bribery, obstruction of Congress, and obstruction of justice. That took place Wednesday. Then Thursday, Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, holds a press conference basically saying that she would be drafting impeachment articles against President Trump, pushing ahead with a rapid timetable that could set the stage for a vote before Christmas to charge President Trump with high crimes and misdemeanors. So they are moving ahead in that direction. Your thoughts?
Just following this, right? I go back to, some of the criticism that was directed at Pelosi while the Mueller probe was going on, which is you got to bring impeachment, and she was like, we have to manage this differently, and she's known as a vote counter, and everyone's thinking, well, she's trying to count the votes, she's trying to protect the freshmen. One of the things that I do think that she was also trying to do was trying to figure out how to get public support for it. Because in her comments recently, she said, this is not what we want to do. This is what our job is, because she knows it's incredibly divisive. And just looking at all the polls, you see that, it swings, that people feel as though he should be impeached but not removed. People said he should be removed. And you can just see the divisiveness, even just by the actions of the Republicans, and just they've even hunkered down even more. I just find one thing I'm curious about is not a lot of people they don't pay a lot of attention to this. There is a difference between an impeachment and a criminal act.
Yes.
And so but they use the terms bribery. So the layperson will say, well, did he commit the crime of bribery? And that's not really what, as I understand it, impeachment is about. It's abuse of power about, use your mic, about your mic, Bob. It's
much broader than that.
right. But again, when you first hear the headlines, you're like, did he commit bribery? The immediate thought for many people is, did he commit the crime of bribery? And there is some nuance and difference between bribery from an impeachment level versus bribery from a criminal act standpoint. And so these whole proceedings, what the GOP side is doing, and Trump and his administration, they're trying to present it as though, well, this is an unfair criminal trial, when actually it's not a criminal trial, it's an impeachment trial, and there is some subtle differences between them.
Well, there's more than subtle, and there's a distinction. Again, this is a political process. This isn't a criminal process. And one of the things that I disagree with, and I think certainly many of us did from the very beginning, going back to the Mueller report, was I didn't think there needed to be this continuing taking of the temperature of the public and the polls. For me,
Yeah, we said that.
the public opinion it wasn't to me again, it wasn't germane to doing your job, what you were elected to do. There was a mandate. That's why the Democrats swept into the House, because there was a mandate to address the behavior of this president.
Right.
And although he continues to say that, it's a Russian hoax, it's been proven not to be a hoax. Right. It's been proven to be that he did obstruct justice. And he continues, as Fatine said,
right.
that's one of the articles of impeachment, by trying to deny Mulvaney and Bolton and so many others what to be, for me, the obligation to testify before Congress. Right. And so he continues to block that. And so, as Bobby said, I think it is important for Pelosi, and I do say she's been doing a very good job. I was critical because I thought that they should have moved on impeachment a long time ago, but I will credit her. I do like how she's been very strategic and very measured and methodical in moving forward now with this process. Nevertheless, I do think that the American people, there should be, and as Nita said, it's messaging, because once again, Republicans are trying to grab hold of the narrative. So the messaging is important to make the American people understand, as Professor Feldman stated during the hearing, if this isn't an impeachable offense, and if a president is not going to be removed for what Trump has done, then what is an impeachable offense, and what does the president have to do to be removed from office?
Right. And also, like, on that point of the messaging, so if we fast forward to next year, which in all likelihood, let's just say the Senate is not going to vote to impeach him, how does the narrative get shaped, and what is the next step of Pelosi and the Dems? What are they going to do, and how are they going to carry this on through the election, like through 2020? That's what I think is going to be the real question.
Right. I think we're looking at history, and it's funny because I was with someone when I was in Mississippi who was telling me all about the things they were doing in the civil rights movement. I said, well, when you were doing these things, did you know you were making history? And he said, no.
Right.
We had no idea we were making history. We were dealing with what was in front of us at the moment. Now we realize it. And in a similar way, we're taking this impeachment thing, as a matter of fact, but this is only the third impeachment trial in the history of the country. It's also
at the president level. At the president level.
Right. And it's the first time that we've had a woman Speaker of the House and the first woman who actually will bring the articles of impeachment out of that House to the Senate. So we're looking at a very historical situation, and I do think that Speaker Pelosi has deported herself well. However, I think that we were right, that the impeachment effort should have started much earlier. And now the Democrats find themselves between a rock and a hard place as to whether to move the impeachment quickly and get it over with, and then have a whole year for Trump to crow that he was found not guilty by the Senate, or should they try to drag this out and then have a negative impact on the election that's going to happen in November. So I actually think we have to keep in mind, left to her own devices, Pelosi would not have brought articles of impeachment. Other congressmen were saying a year in advance. I cite here Congressman Green from Texas and others.
They were saying impeach the MF.
Tlaib said impeach the MF. And the center was resisting, but it was from the pressure that they were getting from the people and from the progressives in Congress to impeach that, in fact, pushed Pelosi. In terms of how the public is feeling, we don't have trial by poll in the United States. And that's what's going on. Well, what do the polls say? Well, damn it, what does the Constitution say?
Thank you.
You have to carry out your duty as bound by the Constitution of the United States of America. This is not trial by should we do this. It's like if I go out and shoot somebody, let's take a poll and see if Larry Ham is guilty.
Yeah.
No, he's guilty. He shot somebody. And the same thing is true here. So it's a situation with the Ukraine. You know, a lot of people, the average person probably has difficulty sinking their teeth into it. I think they understand it, but the question, does it move them at a visceral level? Does it move them? I think people are more moved by the fact, and this is one of the reasons why Trump doesn't want his taxes revealed, because we'll find criminality.
Yes.
We'll find tax evasion.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll find that he's gotten out of paying billions of dollars of taxes, but they threaten to audit us and possibly take us to jail if we hold back a couple of $100.
And that will resonate with the average person because they can get their head wrapped around, right? You know, not a lot of people listen and understand the Constitution. Just listening to the lawyers, I learned a little bit more about the Constitution, and as they talk about the founders, they nailed it. I mean, what they wrote down there, to the controls they put in place to prevent this kind of behavior, there is no doubt about it. Even to the point where Turley, the Republican witness, their legal scholar, he did not even refute anything from the Constitution. His argument was, is it serious enough? So there's a difference between, you know, well, Larry shot the gun, but is it serious enough because he didn't hit anybody?
Right.
So he's not arguing the fact that he didn't do anything. He's just now questioning the seriousness to it. And that's what the founders put in there.
But he also is questioning, which I thought is a very weak argument, and not even a plausible argument, is the continuity of governance. So if you remove him now, how would that disrupt the governing of this country? And that's why you have a vice president. You know, and also, you know, just to go back to Larry's point, you're absolutely right, Larry Ham. The Pelosi and the Dems must communicate to the American people how this definitely impacts their lives. Messaging. Because if there is no, as you use the word visceral, if there is no visceral connection, meaning by him doing this and carrying out the behaviors that he's carrying out, this is how it impacts your life. It impacts your life because 700,000 people will be taken off a snap.
There you go.
That's how. So they must make a direct correlation and have a direct line in between how this behavior and removing him and what he is doing and why he must be removed impacts their day-to-day lives.
And you know what else will be impacted? We will not be able to flush 10 times a day.
Yeah, exactly.
10 or 15.
Flush the toilet.
10 or 15 times
we
a day.
cannot flush the toilet.
So Larry, you ever look like you didn't hear that story?
No, but one of the things
We'll have to fill you in on that story.
well, one of the things that bothers me, and I took notice, was the media last week. Even the media was starting to say that, you know, even though they were talking about polls, they were even pulling back from the polls and saying that those that are looking at the cable news and those that are really following this knows about it. But overall, the general public, it doesn't seem like, not that they're not interested, but how interested are they? And that messaging, which you just said, to tie that in with the snap, the Democrats is something. It seems something is wrong with them.
Well, my sister Netta has been talking about that on this show for years.
Move slow.
For years.
They do not connect this. The Republicans have a better messaging way of putting out what they want to, even if their messaging is incorrect, they have a better way of putting that information out and playing that. The Democrats seem to always try to play fair, and by playing fair, they don't know how to play the game, and that's why they lose.
Well, and they also have like long-winded, intellectual, nuanced discourse instead of
Getting straight
easy
to the
sound
point.
bites. Exactly, talking points. They're getting a little bit better, but they have a long way to
Which
go.
I wanna tie
notice
long
this,
way to
and
go.
let me make this point. Let me make this last point.
Into your point.
Let me make this last point. And I want you to take note of this, because two Fox legal analysts both said, no, that call wasn't a perfect call. And then Turley said on Wednesday the call wasn't perfect. You haven't heard them say that anymore. So they're moving away from that now. The
Right.
call is no longer perfect.
On the call. So if you remember some of the released sort of transcript of it, the president said, "Can you do us a favor?" So his response to that now, I believe it was Wednesday or Thursday of this
Yeah,
week.
us as in the
he
country.
says,
Yes.
"I meant us in the
As
country,
the country, the United States.
us in the United
Right,
States."
yeah, nobody believes that.
Right. And now again, if there was legitimacy to that statement, you would have said that immediately, not weeks, months past all this testimony that's gone out there. It is, there's spin out there. The other thing is, we talk about Pelosi. She talked this week about she's going to bring forth articles of impeachment. There was a conservative reporter who asked her, do you hate the president? And it caused her to just stop in her tracks, turn her head real fast, and just come back to the podium to just lecture him and talk
She
about
handled it well.
Right, she did. Now, if you go back and listen to it, he tries to give justification for why he asked the
Rosen.
question.
Yeah.
His name Rosen, and he says because someone else basically said they didn't like something. So play that out. So I'm asking you, Larry, do you hate someone? And the reason for me asking is because I heard Nither say something. Well, the response would be, go talk to Nither.
Right.
Don't talk to me about it.
Right.
And so she went after him. And the reason I bring that up to the point that Nither made around the messaging is there is a belief that he was a plant to get a soundbite so that they can say, look, here's further evidence that it's a personal attack against him, which is why I think her answer to close it was brilliant.
She did a great job.
Was
Absolutely.
brilliant, which is like,
Great job.
I pray for him. I don't hate him. What he's doing is wrong. The acts that he's doing are cowardly. I pray that he wakes up one day and finds moral.
And she said, "Don't mess with me."
Right.
And speaking of messaging,
we gotta move this thing on, guys.
right? And speaking of messaging, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg said he refuses not to take these advertisements from politicians that may have false information or misinformation. I find that interesting because just this morning it was announced that the Republicans are buying millions of dollars
Yes.
of Facebook ads for anti-impeachment messaging.
Now let me. I want to go back to Jamie, but you said something, and I thought you was going to tie this in also, Bobby, when you mentioned about how Trump comes out and said, "Oh, I was talking about us." You also want to look at the situation when the president came out and said, "Well, I said there was no. I don't want. I don't want no quid pro quo. I don't want that." Basically, the messaging that he's getting out, if you look at the timeline, that is after the fact. That is after the whistleblower
Right.
has
After the
been.
fact.
Exactly. That's why folks have to be up on this to know what's going on. The point I wanted to bring to you, as you mentioned earlier, is what also came out last week that as the Democrats were compiling evidence, was that whole call, as you mentioned, with California Representative Devin Nunes, where he again connected back to the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah.
Connect those dots right there.
Well, Giuliani, and I don't know if there's really there's too many dots.
Right, you ain't need a dot. It's a big blob. It's not even a dot. It's a blob.
It is now, and what's interesting is Devin Nunes, who was the ranking member on the committee, all this time he knew and others knew that he had discussions with Lev Parnev, who were essentially Rudy Giuliani's handlers. They were the ones who Giuliani, these guys were, through Russian oligarchs, pouring millions of dollars into political campaigns and into the Trump campaign. Okay, and so Nunes was trying to use these guys also to dig up dirt on the Bidens, to get information. Of course, this was all false information, and it's proven to be that while it was poor judgment on the part of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, they did nothing illegal. and Biden calling for the removal of the prosecutor, which almost every major country called, or Western nation called for the removal. The European Union and others called for the removal of this prosecutor. And so Nunes, he has to be investigated.
Well, what gets me was, right, so play this out. So I'm picking on...
That's Adam Schiff, by the way.
Adam
That's
Schiff.
not
Devin
Nunes.
Nunes.
According to Trump,
That's
shifty
Devin
shit.
Nunes. So let's play this out, Larry. So you and Nitha are on the panel. Nitha is the ranking member. You're the Nunes role. You're the minority, right? So now the information embedded in that access is evidence showing that you've been on the phone with some of the people being talked about in there. Mm-hmm. And think about the performance he put on Devin Nunes, where
outrageous.
It was just crazy, right? So what kind of conscience does this person have to know that I have a connection to it, I'm not going to recuse myself, and I'm going to not double down, I'm going to triple down and just call it a hoax and be insulting and just, I mean, it was just disgraceful
But you know
what he
about
said.
it? They all use the same playbook. Remember, Trump had over 20 calls in the 6 months prior to the 2016 elections with Roger Stone. Mm-hmm. And we know Roger Stone was intimately involved with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and the Russians.
And where is Stone now?
Stone is about
on the way to jail.
He's on his way.
Waiting for sentencing.
Now, Trump had over 20 calls and said he cannot recall the details of any of those calls.
But he has the
Nunes,
best memory in the world.
the greatest. Nunes
Greatest.
is using the same playbook. He says, and let's credit the Fox reporter, because the Fox reporter said, well, isn't that a call that you would remember? He says, well, we get calls from many important people, internationally. And so now he's claiming.
And with the Lev Parnas, his lawyer said.
Lev Parnas said, hey, Lev remembers. And Lev certainly remembers the call. And it was hashtag let Lev speak. So they do not want him to testify.
Well, Schiff cracked me up because when reporters asked him, when did Nunes get the information? He said he had it ahead of time.
Yeah.
Whether he read it or not, I don't know.
Not only does he have information, but Nunes, as ranking minority leader on the Intelligence Committee, has one of the highest security clearances.
Yes.
So he has access to a whole lot of information. And more than telephone calls, it's alleged that Nunes himself
Yes.
went to Ukraine
And
and met with some
He
people.
did.
Absolutely.
So if you go back to when he was the majority, right? So before the House
Democrats won the House.
Yeah. I remember the first time many people first heard of Devin Nunes is when he took information from a congressional hearing and went straight to the White House.
Walked over to the White House.
Unprecedented.
With the information.
Unprecedented. And he got a bit of censure for that. Nothing more than a little slap on the wrist.
Well, I don't want to say I saved the best for last, but this one, and Larry, I'm going to come to you a little later, man. I'm giving you kudos, man, because you was on point with something, but we'll get to that. So also this week, we saw Senator Kamala Harris basically suspend her campaign.
Can I ring the bell on this one?
Yes.
And Bobby and I had a conversation about you last night, Fatine.
Yeah,
We'll
well,
get to
I
that.
didn't.
We talked about you last
Here we
night.
go.
That's
It was a nice,
fun.
peaceful show while it
There you go.
lasted.
Now, it's interesting, even though in the latest polls she was not polling that high, she still was the top-ranked non-white candidate in the race. She was. So now, all of a sudden, now you're starting to see a lot of finger-pointing and dealing with diversity in the Democratic Party. And you're talking about in the next debate that the stage possibly will be filled with only white candidates. This is very interesting going forward. Now, a lot of people now talking about diversity. We do know that Senator Kamala Harris did not resonate a lot with a lot of black folks due to the fact of her record as a prosecutor in California. So That's one thing. But we do have to look at the diversity going forward, and how does the Democratic Party deal with this? And I throw this out to the panel.
And well, I'll just say what I said on AM Joy last Sunday, where when it is
Get that
okay,
plug in.
yeah, but no, because I'm going to repeat the. Thank you. Sorry, I only got to speak for like 2 seconds, but still, I love being on there. But you know what I said on there? It's like when you are a female candidate, and especially a woman of color, you are scrutinized much more intensely than the male counterparts. So I'm not saying that yes, there
Male
isn't
white counterparts.
then. Well, and especially male white counterparts. Yes, you're right, Fatine. That there isn't a place or room for critique. Obviously, of course there is, but you don't see the same level. Like you don't see people going after Bloomberg to the same level with his stop and frisk and a whole bunch of other nonsense. You don't see the same level of scrutiny against Biden and the crime bill. Like you see a little mention here and there, but the amount of hit pieces that were done on her, like that's one aspect of it. And then we have been talking about on this show forever about how the Democratic Party needs to diversify much more in the leadership level, and also how the party needs to support the candidates that are of color too, because that's part of it too. Who do they back? Who do they support? Even in smaller elections, not only the presidential. And I think this in 2016, I remember we talked about it too when Hillary Clinton chose Kane as her VP nominee. She could have picked a person of color, but she chose instead a white guy who could speak Spanish because they thought that was enough to placate to people of color. And in 2020, it's ridiculous that, like you said, Fatine, there's not going to be one person of color on that debate stage when we're supposed to be, the Democratic Party is supposed to be the diverse party, and we're going into 2020, and the base is much more diverse and progressive and liberal, and this is where we are. I mean, I think it's inexcusable in this day and age.
Just want to say,
Sure, brother.
and it's a party that is supported largely by black women.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. Which is interesting, and I just want to go back, and I said, we had a conversation about you.
I'm
last
waiting
week.
for it.
I told Bobby, I said, listen, and let me just say this: Kamala Harris is a very talented, very intelligent, very dynamic sister. My point in putting it out there after the first debate, where you, my brother,
Right.
and it seems like almost every host, particularly the women, and let me make this point. Okay. And I understand why it's important for you women to push a candidate that they felt was very qualified, a woman who they felt that had all the necessities to be the nominee. And I understand that there should have been enthusiasm, but I felt that, first of all, there was a lack of authenticity. At least that's the way it came across. That was number one. And this just wasn't coming from me. This was coming from, again, I'm speaking to my mother, a black woman who votes in whether it's a local, national, every election, right? And she was unmoved by Kamala. Her comments were, she's a very smart woman, but she didn't really feel her from that, again, use the word, that visceral emotional connection, which Trump used to rally his base. They had this emotional connection with him. I didn't see the authenticity. I didn't think that the debate, to me, as I said, was a performance. She performed well. Mm-hmm. But once you get past the performance, all right, what is behind that? And we saw, for me, again, she never clearly articulated, and she never really was able to establish what the public and with the voters and with the Democratic base, why are you running for president? Why do you want to be president? Then she began a flip-flop, which again showed that what she was doing was, again, moving according to the polls. According to the polls. And we're talking about day by day. And so I said, listen, she's going to get a bump, but you'll see her fall back because there wasn't the connection. And as you said, Fatine, this is a party primarily driven by black women. And I'm hearing black women, and they really weren't very supportive of feeling her. I think in large numbers.
I don't agree with that because I talked to a lot of black women who were supporting her, who were behind her.
Overall, I agree with that. Overall, they still are behind Biden.
Of different generations behind Biden.
Of different generations, they were supporting her too. And again, what I was saying earlier too, the point that there's much more emphasis placed on female candidates, specifically and especially women of color, to be that quote unquote likable or authentic authentic, or whereas you don't see that same level of scrutiny on the other ones.
I disagree.
Where you don't see that, like to Biden, you don't see people going to Biden or Bloomberg saying, "Oh, well, they're not authentic. They're not,
I
they're
think we
just
see
being a
them at Bloomberg.
politician."
No, I think
And
we
I'm
see them
not
at
saying
Bloomberg
there's
now.
not. Again, I'm not saying there's not room for criticism. The campaign did mess up, in certain areas, and she should be critiqued for her past. But the level of, like, just in that last week alone, you had, I believe it was the New York Times and the Washington Post that both did hit job pieces on her, basically saying her campaign was over before it was technically even over. So I'm saying the level of, like, you have to be likable, you have to be authentic, you have to be X, Y, and Z. The level of scrutiny and the intense focus on someone like a Kamala is much different. Now you're finally seeing some. Now you're finally. Wait, no. But like with Buttigieg, for example, you're finally this week. You're finally seeing some level of, like, scrutiny, and suddenly you see a lot of people coming to his defense saying, but wait, but listen, but people, but it's interesting. But it's interesting that a lot of journalists even are coming out and saying that, like a lot of centrist journalists are coming out and saying, well, this is the progressive wing trying to go after Buttigieg because they just want Bernie Sanders and they're being way too hard on him. And this is now he's only finally getting this level of scrutiny now, whereas people like Kamala and even Sanders, of course, and Castro and you go down the list, they get it much more.
But just make this last comment. And you make great points, and I'm not disagreeing on all the points, but she basked in the attention of coming out of that debate as someone who was now elevate herself as a co-front runner, right? And so before Warren,
but she did well in that debate. In that debate, she did well.
Bernie pretty much was always, right there at the top, of the polls in terms of.
Yeah, I'm not saying he wasn't. I never said that.
But after that debate, Kamala moved rapidly after one night, and so shot up. And what did she do? She tried to, as rightfully so, she tried to capitalize on that, and she basked in the glow, and she positioned herself and embraced the new title of being a co-front runner. And again, I'm just,
her messaging didn't resonate. It didn't.
So I don't think.
And she did flip flop on different things.
But let me say this. Now you make that point. How much scrutiny has Bernie taken? I mean, Bernie has.
Well, that's my point.
That's what I was going to come to, Larry. That's what I was going to say.
Well, that's my point.
There's someone like Bernie. Bernie has probably got more scrutiny than anyone.
I'm not talking about Bernie. I'm talking about the candidates like Buttigieg, Biden, Bloomberg, the ones that a lot of people are pushing for because they are the quote unquote centrist candidates and want them to be.
So listen, they all I'll just say is this, right? So they all will have a moment because there's so many of them, right? And Larry's talked about this before, right? There's just too many of them. But every time one rises a bit, they become the target.
Absolutely.
And so, it's Buttigieg's time now.
When you said hers was before she even rose,
right,
though.
But
that's what
it
I'm
is.
saying.
But it is, right? So now you get the post-op when they're like all the criticism around it, right? So just want to involve some of our viewers out there. So Edward Ladson says, Harris was a one-trick pony. Let's be real. That exchange with Biden was her best moment, and then it went down from there.
That is harsh. That is harsh, Edward.
BB Rodriguez. Chameleon, so she spelt it almost like chameleon, is a whole phony and fraud and would not take identity with black identity politics. She knew she could play her chameleon role authentically, so she withdrew early, thank God. Edward again. Harris had the Hillary problem. She's a robot, a Stepford candidate, if you would.
Damn, you guys are harsh.
And that's not
Those are viewers. Got one more. Cheryl J, 64. No loss with Kamala. She didn't resonate with the black community. She ran a hollow campaign. Pat Johnson, neither I do agree with your comments on how women are scrutinized more than men.
Yeah, let me just get in here.
Thank you.
Two more. DB4A. DB4A says DB4A states there will be another opportunity for a black president, but that president can't be seen as only a president for blacks. Obama has already showed us how a black can be elected. SFC Marion Hill states there were better black female candidates than Kamala, but she's the one that basically went in there. And then Anthony Long, Kamala Harris ran a weak campaign. She tried to use the Barack Obama formula, but failed.
And I'm just let Larry, and Larry, this is thrown at you. You've said from day one, going back years, that the party wasn't going to embrace these neoliberals trying to move into that
No.
space.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what she presented herself and how people saw her as someone who's a neoliberal who tried to essentially toe that line.
Right.
You know, one day she's, progressive, then she moves back to being a moderate.
Right.
And so I don't think people really, as you said, Fatine, that didn't resonate. And I said that from day one.
Resonate. No.
Right. First
I'm-
on Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris said that she's coming out of the race because she couldn't raise the money. That's what she said.
Yes.
She couldn't raise the money. And I think that, of course, I think diversity is important. Of course, we should have African American and other candidates of color and women. No argument there. But the problem is our political system is driven by money. And what we see is that in America, the people who have the most money are white people. And so when you come to a Waterloo like this, there's only but so much fundraising the black candidates can do. And it's almost inevitable that they're going to be outraised by white candidates. And I would say that in one sense, the outcome with Kamala Harris and the outcome with all the candidates, because it's not just Kamala Harris that has dropped
Joe
out.
Biden is trying to
You
raise the money right
Even
now.
Castro wasn't even on the debate
Castro's,
stage. Yeah.
Cory
all
Booker,
of them,
yeah.
all of them are going to be out because they can't raise the money.
Which
and
is so
you're gonna-
crazy because they have millions of dollars and they still, it's not enough.
and this is the abomination of the American political
Citizens
system.
United must be overturned.
That's
You
right.
have two billionaires that are going to be part of this race.
Citizens
that are
United
part of this
must
race.
be overturned. When they allowed unlimited money and allowing these political action committees, these PACs, to spend as much money as they can, that was essentially the destruction of this political system where you said, Larry, money fuels these political
So
campaigns.
just
man.
building off what Larry's talking about the money, right? So when you think of Kamala Harris, if she's trying to attract the black support and get those dollars, but we already know that a lot of those dollars, the young progressive blacks, was going to Bernie. We know that the older black was going to Biden. You have Cory Booker in there. So Kamala and Cory are fighting for what's left. That's not enough. Then you get a Bloomberg who comes in, and he's throwing $30 million just in ads like in a week.
37. to be
37 in a week, right? You talked about, Larry, the Republican, these super PACs who are pouring millions and millions of dollars in Facebook ads out there. So you're right, money is the root of all of this out there. And so Cory will hold on a little bit because, Bob, I know Cory's your man. He'll hold on because he'll get a little bit.
He got a little a
of
bump
what,
from her.
what Kamala,
Yeah.
right? So that'll keep him in there a little bit longer, but he's not gonna make it either.
Right.
And then you're talking about Buttigieg, and I just have to read this. Edward, you always have a gem each week, so I got to read this one if people haven't seen it.
Our surrogate panel member.
Yeah,
They need him on, man.
Buttigieg is still in it only because he reminds us of Marty McFly. Let's be real. If Biden and him became the ticket in 2020, the Back to the Future memes will begin.
Yes, and that is a Back to the Future reference,
That's
the
right.
movie, people.
That's
For those
right.
of you that don't know.
Marty
And
McFly.
what's interesting, too, and let's look at what's happening with, as you said, Buttigieg is getting the scrutiny. Let's look at what's happening with Buttigieg and Bloomberg with the stop and frisk. And it goes back to the old political adage of Fatine, all politics is local. And as mayors, both Bloomberg and Buttigieg, they had policies that in many ways were unfavorable and really oppressive, to stop and frisk. And Buttigieg had his trouble in South Bend,
Yeah.
with
And
a
also
lot of,
working with, what is it,
McKinsey.
McKinsey,
thank
working
you.
with, and
Yeah.
Bobby talked about that. We talked about that last night, so Bobby can expound that a little bit
Yeah.
further. But McKinsey, and so because they were mayors, they didn't have the national platform. While Bloomberg, obviously, mayor of New York City, you had a national platform. We're talking about difference between being a senator, a congressman, and really having that extensive federal, record as a lawmaker, as opposed to just being a mayor. And so it's pretty interesting how what they did as mayors is now really coming back, and that's being scrutinized.
Yeah, and it's ridiculous that Bloomberg, I believe he was on with Gayle King, and said that, nobody ever questioned me about stop and frisk until I decided to run for president. I'm like, really?
that's not
Are you
true.
kidding
Yeah,
me?
I mean,
Like
national level,
there were protests all over the city.
know.
Remember the silent protests that even Reverend Sharpton led, and then not to mention every single reporter that would always question him. And even when the federal judge decided that stop and frisk was unconstitutional, he did a press conference where he lashed out at the media and yelled at them years ago. This is like 2013.
It was so disingenuous what he said, because Gayle King's question to him was, why are you apologizing now? And he said, because this is the first time someone's asked me, which was
Such
just
a lie.
so
I mean,
such nonsense.
the
right?
audacity
But
to-
again, what I was talking to Jamie about last night. So let's put that to say, okay, let's say he's correct on that. Then it poses a bigger issue for me and hopefully everyone else, which is as soon as you knew you did something wrong, you're not going to admit it. You have to wait for someone to ask you. That's even a worse reason for you to be running this
and
country
it's such a
out there.
lie. He was still defending it in January
Yes,
of this year.
I know, it's
at
crazy.
an event.
So on the Buttigieg piece, right? So he's getting a scrutiny, and it's just, I just laugh at this one, right? Everybody has a life before they run for office, and we know what politics is. So people want to know, and Elizabeth Warren was very vocal about his past client relationships when he worked at McKinsey over 10 years
Now
ago.
explain what
Which is
McKinsey
a
is.
So
consulting-
McKinsey is one of the top 4 consulting firms out there. Price Waterhouse Coopers, Deloitte, Accenture, and McKinsey. So they're big. They do consulting firms. So he had 7 clients in the times that he worked there. People wanted to know who the clients were and what those involvements are. So in many cases, there are non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. So he's trying to balance and trying to come across as transparent, but also respect NDAs before he was in politics.
NDA is a
It's a
Non-disclosure.
non-disclosure agreement, right? So he's trying to protect that. So
Well,
he
and supposedly McKinsey is not letting him out of the NDA right now.
well,
That's
no consulting
Yeah.
firm would, right? Because
Right.
that's a damage to their reputation.
Yeah.
And so
And their clients.
what gets me is, they believe that McKinsey, one of McKinsey's clients was ICE, which could be true. But the time frame was over 10 years ago. So all the bad press
that
about
doesn't
ICE,
negate-
No. All I'm saying is all the bad press about ICE in the last few years, people are going to try to make a connection to say, well, because you supported ICE as one of your clients for McKinsey over 10 years ago, then you have responsibility for this now when he wasn't even in politics. And so I understand, as we always talked about politics, right? This is pure politics, and he has to figure out how to manage through it. And to your earlier point about scrutiny, could we apply the same scrutiny on both sides to Trump's background?
Yes,
because his background
that absolutely,
is worse.
that absolutely I agree, but I disagree.
messaging,
I think
again, is flawed.
I disagree that there does need to be transparency, and I understand NDA, it's not in his control. I totally get that, but in regards to, yes, it was over 10 years ago, but you still in that position, we need to know what exactly he was doing and not doing. And even though, yes, the ICE stuff has been much more focused now, you still need that transparency to know, because people are very concerned about what exactly in that position, like who you're consulting for, who are you, what sort of monies are you managing, or whatever you're doing.
Well,
and there needs to be, and I disagree. I think there is. I think the scrutiny against
Is
him
there a
with that
line?
is.
Let me ask you: Is there a line
okay.
to that? Right. So, I'll take you. So you start to run for office, and over 10
I'm
years
never
ago,
running for
hold
office.
this, let's say you were, and
Never
over
say
10,
never.
10 years ago, you dated somebody, and now you broke up. That's in the
That's
past.
a personal
fair
matter.
game. It's fair
That's
game.
a per-
But
yeah,
it's
but
fair
it would
game.
still
But
come
no,
in.
no, but
But
fair
you know
game.
what?
But how
In
does-
this day and age,
This
it would
is-
all
it's
come.
fair
It
game.
would all
Listen,
come
let me
into
say this.
play.
10 years ago, it's fair game.
And when it comes
Yeah.
to NITA,
Yeah.
this doesn't even sound like a hypothetical.
Yeah, this is
Do not listen to the
this
lies.
is fair game.
This is not even a hypothetical.
But I want to. I understand
But
the
it's-
point.
but-
I understand the point.
the
But
route-
let me just say this. because I want to move this on. Because a couple weeks ago, AOC got behind and endorsed Bernie. You was there. And this week, again, because of so much news out there, I'm not saying this was swept under the rug, but it didn't get much play, where you had former Secretary of the State John Kerry coming out and supporting Joe Biden. And what they hope that does is start to show up, because what's very interesting is Bloomberg getting in the race very, very late. As you talk about, what, 57 billion?
37 on the ads in the first day, and then he said he's going to spend $1 billion of his own money.
And he and he's polling at 5% already. He's polling at 5%. So
Speaks to Larry's point.
so now here comes Joe Biden, because the
good
Dems
picture.
that are behind him want to basically give him some stability, because he's starting to slip in the polls here.
Yes.
But even though he's slipping in the polls, he still hasn't tanked. He has not tanked yet. So what is your thoughts about John Kerry supporting Biden?
Well, before that, I'm going to challenge Larry to some push-ups, like Biden challenged.
He a voter, or somebody who was at his
person
event,
that was in
a
the
guy
audience
that
at
challenged
one of the rallies.
Yeah, because
So-
he questioned him about Biden and
health.
I'm sorry,
No, no,
Biden's
his
son.
son,
Yeah,
yeah.
and brought that up, and then so Biden just took it to a whole
And he
nother
also
level.
said, he thought he was too
and-
old.
Yeah. Oh, that's
So-
true.
so
he
that's
did,
when
and
Biden
that's when he
challenged
was
him.
like, "Yeah,
And this
well,
guy
I'll
was in his
challenge you
70s
to
as well.
push-ups."
And he was a big guy.
Yeah. So Biden challenged him to do some
The guy,
push-ups.
the guy
is
was older than Biden, and
ridiculous.
Biden, and so this is part of Biden's No Malarkey tour. So he has his bus tour through Middle America, Iowa, and it was at one of these rallies that this happened out there. Now people
No
actually
malarkey.
liked his response because they showed some life and some feistiness with
Right.
Yeah, and he told him
Biden.
you're a liar. He went at him. He went at
But the other thing that he said that just reinforces what a lot of people feel about the Democrats is he had an interview where he said that people are misassessing where the Democratic Party is. It is not as far progressive as people want it to be.
Right.
It is closer to the middle, and that's why I believe I have the best shot for it. And all this, far left and more progressive, that's not the core of the
And
party
he
at
has,
this point.
he has a strong
instead-
part of the black vote right now.
Instead of aiming at Bernie Sanders, which he and Hillary and former President Obama have done of late, they should be aiming at Bloomberg, because Bloomberg is the one that's going to hurt Biden. Bernie Sanders and Biden appeal to different wings of the party. Bloomberg is trying to appeal to the middle, and he's going to take votes
That's
from
why
Biden.
That's why I believe John Kerry came out Thursday to endorse him. I think
Right.
that's the first shot.
Right, but see, here's the problem. What Bloomberg is doing is obscene, and it demonstrates beyond the shadow of a doubt that we live in a plutocracy. And Bloomberg has so much money that he can operate above the law, above institutional infrastructure. Imagine a man with so much money that campaign finance laws won't apply to him because he'll be spending his own money.
Right.
He's buying the election.
Yeah.
It is anti-democratic.
Right.
It is contradictory to the very values that we profess to everybody else in the world.
He'd rather do that than let Trump win again. That's what his messaging is. That's what he says.
Yeah,
That's what he said.
But that's
on
his
Larry's point. I just want to raise this. On Larry's point, it's been disclosed that he has generated $1 billion already for his campaign.
No,
His own
that's
money.
his own money.
His own money.
His
As
own
Larry
money.
pointed out.
Well, he's generated some money, though. He has generated, not $1 billion, though,
Yeah.
but he's generated a large sum of money already.
It has been reported $1 billion is already into his campaign account.
Yeah, but Larry
That's
said
his money.
From his money. Now let me just go back to what you said, Fatina. I'm posing this question.
Right.
Going back, number
That's a
one,
lot of money.
how much gravitas does these endorsements have? And secondly, Larry, you said this, and I am really seeing this more clearly, and I think
That's
this is
why I
what
said that.
this is what it's moving toward. I think you're absolutely right when you have talked about over and over again a broker convention. And I see that. I see a strong possibility of there being a broken convention, especially with Bloomberg entering this race.
Right, that's interesting. Now let me ask you this here real quick to move on. Let's just look at this, and as things play out, we don't know which way it's going to go. But as we look, let's just say the House impeaches Trump. The Senate does not vote to remove him. Okay, he moves forward. Now, look at these numbers that came out. Now, we rightfully so, in the past we said this is what President Obama put in place. But there's a time where Trump, these numbers, these job numbers, and you can't say when you're going to use them. Oh, I'm not going to use them because Trump is there. Trump is there. These job numbers that came out for the month of November is off the hook. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. These job numbers. You have where in November 266,000 jobs were raised, better than the 187,000 jobs that were expected by the economists.
Were raised or created?
So yes, but
created.
but just run those numbers in 206 and 187, right? So 107 was 266,
yes,
and 187. 187 was the forecast. 266 is where it is. So
yes.
Two things to know about that: over 40,000 of those were GM jobs that were not working during the strike and are now back in the number,
You didn't let me
right?
finish. I was going to go to the end of the GM strike had a big effect, bolstering
Right.
employment in motor vehicles parts by 41,300 of an overall 54,000 gain in manufacturing.
Right. So that would still, however, make it, there was some growth above the 187. You take the 40,000 out, you back it out. Now, what happens every time there is a restatement? So before everyone starts jumping and say, well, I guess he's doing the right thing, wait until the next two reports, because there's always, and this has been consistent through every presidency, there is a restatement that occurs. Things were lower, things were higher, so temper that. Now, that all being said, when you look at the Obama years in terms of actual jobs created, he still created more jobs than this president has out there.
But that's not what I'm saying. The point I'm trying to make is, listen, okay, I got that point. Black unemployment is 5.5, white is 3.2, adult women is 3.2, which is the same as adult men. Hispanics is 4.2, teenagers 12.0, and Asians at 2.6%. The point I'm trying to make is, if we looked at George Bush, we look at Ronald Reagan, and when black unemployment was double figures, we used that report against the president. So I'm just saying, why are we always putting out these numbers, putting an asterisk there where we didn't do this before against Republican presidents? That's what I'm just saying. Fair is fair. And even though you talk about this restatement, these numbers are not going to blow up. This black unemployment is not going to go double figures. I doubt that, Bobby. I really do.
No,
I'm just saying, when
also,
damage you do, damage you don't.
And you have to look deeper into the numbers. Are these jobs that are paying livable wages?
Exactly. I was just about to say
Did
that.
we do that when we went at Reagan and Bush?
We did.
Yes,
Yeah,
we
that's
did.
what I'm.
Are these jobs permanent or are these temporary jobs?
We went at them because the unemployment rate was so high. These numbers are not that high, but we still saying, well, these numbers are
Well, they have to be
Well, we're
scrutinized.
also
and are
in-
those jobs that are providing health insurance?
Yeah, I was gonna say we're also in the gig economy where it's like people are working.
It's a gig economy.
Like they're driving Uber or they're doing whatever, and they have multiple jobs, and it's still
How much
not
security?
enough.
How much security
It's still not enough for
are these
healthcare
jobs-
or to
how
put
much
food on the
security
table.
are these jobs providing? And manufacturing, which is a sector that, thank you, Bobby, manufacturing is plummeting. And so that's really where, he said he's going to have his greatest impact, manufacturing. And Bobby, give me that again. There you go. There you go.
So here are some staple jobs that, so when you look underneath it, this gives you a better indication of it, right? Manufacturing jobs, they're down, right? That's a significant blow to the GDP, which is why the GDP is slowing down, right? The other one is infrastructure. Now, when he came into office, infrastructure, by all accounts, was a bipartisan thing
And let
that
me say
would
before we
be
continue,
easy.
they stopped
Easy.
Obama, who first and foremost proposing infrastructure, but the Republicans shut it down.
So there's been no significant infrastructure work. Now, infrastructure work puts people to work. Many of those jobs are union-related jobs, which will standardize and sustain some wages. Those, curiously or not, have never made it to fulfillment in his presidency so far.
Correct.
And as Jamie, you pointed out, when Obama tried to do it, they shut him down. So you got to look underneath there, right? And I've said before, right now, and I look at this stuff. I talk to people in it. There's a concern because no one can come up with a good answer as to why the consumer is continuing to spend the way they are because corporations are sitting on a bunch of money. So the economy is clearly being driven by consumer spending. And what history has proven is as soon as companies pull back, then your spending goes down because only one part of the equation is so there's three parts to the equation. Government spending is like off the chain, right? I mean, we're $1 trillion in debt. That's the trajectory we're going. Consumer spending is still going for. Corporate spending has slowed down, and what I mean by corporate spending is investments. Companies don't know where to invest. They have the money, and the reason why they don't know where to invest is, as we started off this show, the world stage is where companies want to invest. And if you have instability in understanding the dynamics that are going on, you're not going to put money in there and have it be swallowed up and disappear. The trade agreements, right? We have one of the most messed up set of trade agreements that people can't figure out where am I going to place my bet because it flip-flops out there. So that uncertainty, you need all three of those legs to be going to say you're going to have a strong economy. This is why you're going to continue to hear reports in 2020 about things slowing down and teetering out there.
Yeah. Switching gears here as we start to wind down. Barr was in the news this week. Attorney General Bill Barr suggested in a speech Tuesday night that continued police protection for certain communities in the United States could ultimately depend on those communities showing more respect and support for law enforcement. He went on to say, I think today American people have to focus on something else, which is the sacrifice and the service that is given by our law enforcement officers. And they have to start showing more than they do the respect and support that law enforcement deserve. And if communities don't give that support and respect, that might find themselves without the police protection they need. That's what the Attorney General saying. And you know, when it comes to the black community, because of our history and factual records that support that the police in the black community have numerous issues with brutality and this, that, and the other. And we question law enforcement, rightfully so. That's what he's saying, that if we don't
this
support...
This is top law enforcement.
So basically, you know
Official.
what? We're not going to police your areas. Basically, you police them yourself, or you're just not going to get any support from us.
Well, Larry said earlier that, we're looking at historic times. This is another chapter in that history about the Bill Barr's tenure as the head of the justice, the Attorney General. Because in addition to that, there's reports that he commissioned that are supposed to come out next week on the FBI and the Pfizer and, whether they spied or not and all that stuff there, that, early reads are there's like nothing to it.
Right.
And he got out ahead of time and said, well, I disagree with it. A report that he commissioned that's going to be released, he preempted by saying he disagrees with the guy who did it, right? But to your point about the police,
Yes.
We had an unfortunate shooting, again, in Florida. UPS driver gets kidnapped, a jewelry heist. They take him and the driver. Now, there is footage out there to talk about police behavior where I guess they thought they were on a movie set. They were in broad daylight on a highway. The UPS van is in the center lane. There are other pedestrians in their cars, civilians in their car driving by. The police jump out of their vehicle. They run behind a civilian car and exchange fire with the shooters in the van. Now, play this out. You get return fire. I'm behind Nither's car. Nither's driving, trying to get out the way. Nither can get hit. I'm shooting. It goes through the truck, and on the other side, Bob Pickett is driving his car, and his car gets hit. You can't tell me that is proper police procedure. And, and listening to it and reading people, there are people who train in the military, and they said, we don't even do that in the military. So these, again, talking about policing, and then we're going to wait for the autopsy to see the driver, which was his first day as a solo driver driving that truck. He was usually the second on the truck. It was his first time being a solo. He gets caught out there. He gets shot. To waiting the autopsy to see which bullet killed him. Was it the police fire? Or the jewel thieves.
And just this week, you had reporting about an NYPD officer who came out and said that he basically blew the whistle, saying that they were required to have quotas, and when it was a Black or Latino suspect or somebody being taken in, they roughed them up. I mean, he came out on the record saying that when they even raised their concerns, that they got, I forgot what the exact quote was, but got pushback and threats from up above. And this came out just this week alone. Right. So, and here you have the top law enforcement official, Barr, saying some nonsense like this.
Well, Barr was speaking to the Black community.
Yes, of course.
He was talking
that's straight to us.
He didn't say Black, but that message
that's
was
us.
to Black people.
That's why I brought
because
it up. That's to us.
The fire of criticism has been coming for the last umpteen years from Black people. The whole effort to reform police, I would say not exclusively from Black people, but Black people have been in the forefront of the struggle against police brutality.
Larry, can I just add this to you?
Yes.
You're talking about a Black president that came in, talked about this type of reform, and you're talking about consent decrees that were passed on across this country by a Black president and his and his Justice Department. And this message here, I know I cut you, but I wanted to add that in there.
Well, the inverse is true here. The president that currently sits in the White House got the endorsement of one of the institutions that is seen by Black people to be antithetical to our interests, and that's the Fraternal Order of Police, who oppose all efforts at reform and accountability and community control. They are the first ones right now in New Jersey. The FOP is fighting all the way up to the state Supreme Court to stop the implementation of a police review board in the city of Newark.
I remember one of Jeff Sessions.
Yes, all the way up to the state Supreme Court.
I remember one of Jeff Sessions' first acts as the Bill Barr's predecessor was to make it more prohibitive for police to be prosecuted for police shootings.
Right.
And so this is just a continuation, or as Fatine said, even going back to the Obama administration. Let's be fair.
Right.
And so the Black community, as you pointed out, he was speaking directly to the Black community and the Latino community and poor communities.
Right.
Let's be clear, he was speaking to poor white communities as well, who, not at the same level as Black communities, are facing the same issues, with police. And so this is something that, again, until we have someone in the office who is going to stand up and say, the Department of Justice really is an independent body and should be protecting the people, first and foremost. And we always say there are far more good cops, ethical cops, lawful cops than there are lawless cops and unethical. But those that are, they're being protected and giving license to do what they do.
And those that are running for president, if the president is not going to come out and say anything against this, and of course the Justice Department, the head, is saying this, then the candidates need to, you can't wait for a debate to bring this up.
Thank you.
You have to be out front. I say that to say this. There's another story that happened this week with Representative Ilhan Omar, where you had, and this was reported by the Tampa Bay Times, that George Buck, a Republican running for Congress in St. Petersburg, Florida, sent out a fundraising email calling for Omar to be killed. In this November 26th letter, reportedly, stated, repeated and unsupported accusation that U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar, a Somali-born Democrat representing Minnesota, secretly works for the country of Qatar and should be gravely punished for it. We should hang these traitors where they stand. That's what the email states. And if the president is not going to come out, if the Justice Department is not going to come out, then those that are running for office should come out.
Please,
And
yeah. The president went after her himself, remember?
You know,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's why they should be out front.
Right. So let me just add to that a bit, right? And Larry, you brought this up earlier about Facebook, right? So Twitter finally suspended the account of one of her Republican challengers, Danielle Stella, after she called for the
But
congresswoman.
Facebook didn't. Yeah.
Right, for the congresswoman to be tried for treason and hanged if an unproven conspiracy theory that Omar gave sensitive
That's a lynching.
information to Iran were confirmed. And then the Tampa Bay story that you reported. So these are two different people who went out there with this conspiracy theory and said that she should be hanged for treason.
Well, who said it more directly?
The president, right?
No. Then Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who recently said Trump is trying to get us killed. See, every time Trump goes in one of his rallies or one of his press conferences and makes a statement criticizing Omar, Waters, Tlaib, you know, Waters was really in his bullseye for a long time. It activates these crazy, violent people in his base. And they go after. They already tried and convicted someone who said that he was going to kill Maxine Waters.
Yeah.
Right, right.
You know? So when Trump makes these remarks, everybody laugh, ha, 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 ha. No, it's not funny because it may on the surface appear humorous, but it's a signal to those crazy, violent people that follow him to go out, send emails, make telephone calls, stalk,
Yeah.
and
I mean,
if possible, do harm.
the amount of death threats against all of those women went up exponentially every time Trump talks about them. And let's not forget, like, it's so crazy that in this insane news cycle world we live in, how quickly people forget about stuff. But the guy who sent the bombs, remember, to CNN, to a whole bunch of officials, like, that actually happened. Thankfully, nothing went off. Things were caught. But this stuff generates a response and incites people, like you said, Larry, and terrible action comes about.
And
from
social
it.
media, is certainly a wonderful tool. But then you have, as Larry said, it is used to incite. Just think about QAnon and how that group and that conspiracy theory group, they're the ones who are putting out many of these conspiracy theories, which you have thousands of people who follow it, who believe it, who take it as gospel. And again, those people, as you said, Larry, those people are disturbed, and many of them are prepared and ready to act. Remember, when someone who supported QAnon went into that pizza shop because they said Hillary Clinton was running, what was that, the sex ring?
Child sex
ring out of the pizza shop.
Out the basement.
Out the basement.
He demanded to be in the basement so he could see this.
Or the one that Bobby mentioned. So they suspended the Twitter account, but then they took their message to Facebook. Or the fact that Zuckerberg was sitting down meeting with Trump and some other right wingers talking about freedom of speech, because they always use that as the guise under which they allow all this stuff to fester, especially on places like Facebook.
Or that talk show host, what's his name? Savage? What's his name?
Michael
Savage. Mike Savage.
Michael Savage, yeah.
Mike Savage, for years, was perpetrating the lie that those children in Florida were not shot to death.
Plus Alex Jones.
Alex Jones. I'm sorry, I take it back. Alex Jones.
The families are suing him.
No, they sued him and won in court.
You're right.
Sandy Hook.
He has to pay millions of dollars in damages.
Yeah, child actors, all that other nonsense.
So who Trump has frequently referenced.
There you go.
Exactly. Listen, two more things, and then we have to wrap it up because we done hit almost that 2-hour mark.
Well, Anthony Long did ask me a sports question.
Let me go before. Well, first of all, I was gonna say that I was gonna turn to the Sports Brothers, but here in New York, there's nothing happening this week. A very quiet week in New York sports. I know they're looking at me. Go ahead.
Facetiously, he said
You
that.
know that. Go ahead, brother, because they waiting for the New York
What
Knicks.
was the
Go
question?
ahead, brother.
Well, no, see, Anthony Long asked us to show open up. He said, hey, so what about those Knicks? And so, New York Knicks off to another terrible start of the season. They fired their head coach, David Fizdale, in his second year. He had a combined record of, I think it was 23 and 83, something like that. So you had 20% winning percentage, which was just the worst in franchise
He only won
history.
17 games last year.
And four this year, so 21. So 21 and 83
He's
is
the only
his
one.
record. So he got let go, and they have an interim coach, Mike Miller, in there. So Jamie and I talked about this a lot. And so, people are wondering why the president, Steve Mills, and the general manager, Scott Perry, because they hired Fizdale, they're the ones who made the decision as to what players will be on this roster, how they get to keep their jobs where Fizdale loses his job. Because their plan A was last year to get a lot of young players and try to develop them as peripheral complementary players, clear cap space, and then this year use that salary room to attract big-name free agents like Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Jimmy Butler, Kawhi Leonard. They didn't get any of them.
Right.
So then they go to plan B. So plan A doesn't work, so go to plan B. And plan B was they got some second-tier free agents to say, okay, well, we'll be competitive and we'll still try to develop the young guys. The problem is they got the wrong plan B free agents because they're not complementary to one another. They do a lot of the same things, and they have no go-to person. Last night they lose a game at home in Indiana by 1 point because the person that they gave the biggest contract to, Julius Randle, can't hit a free throw. He had a chance to hit a free throw to put the game in overtime. He hit the first, he missed the second.
Yep.
And Fizdale was hired, we believe, to coach established stars, not develop young guys. And so when plan A didn't work, he's stuck with guys that just don't fit the way that his strength is out there. So they let him go out there. And so we're all going to see how this new interim coach who had success in the San Antonio Spurs organization, he coached the Knicks G League. He was actually recommended to the Knicks when Phil Jackson was here because of his understanding of offensive philosophy, and former Knick and general manager of the G League, Allen Houston, actually hired him. So he's been around the organization for 5 years. This was his first year joining the professional club out there.
Bobby,
Now he's the interim
Nat
coach.
Turner says that Fizdale wasn't the problem. He was a scapegoat for bad management.
And it's an organizational failure. And let me say this. Bobby and I were sitting at the game Thursday night. We've been in this building literally thousands of times. Over 20 years ago,
Yes.
25 years ago, we were covering the Knicks together. So we have our thing going.
25 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yes,
Don't worry,
we
you
That's how I brought this brother
were-
in.
we were covering
You
the
were
Knicks.
born, though, so
Exactly.
don't act like you weren't
I didn't
born.
say I wasn't born.
So we've been there through so many changes, but we have our finger on the pulse of what's going on. And Bobby and I were literally Thursday at halftime. We were telling the reporters who were sitting with us, we said Fizdale's going to get fired tonight.
Yeah.
Whoa.
We did say that.
Yeah.
We didn't have any inside information.
Right.
We just felt the building, and we were watching Steve Mills, Scott Perry, the president and GM, and we were watching them, and the fans were booing, and the energy in the building. And Bobby and I were telling our fellow reporters, we said, it's unfortunate he's getting fired tonight.
Yeah.
He was fired less than 24 hours later, but he was effectively fired that night.
Oh, yeah.
They waited till the next day to
After
make
practice.
the
After
announcement.
practice, he got
But
fired.
it was evident, and again, this is an organizational affair. This is not his fault. He wasn't given the talent. Now, could the team have been playing with more energy, more effort at times?
Yes.
Certainly, but as the brother said, to scapegoat Fizdale and to say he was the problem, there's no evidence of that because they've had 5-6 coaches in the past decade, and they've had no sustained success.
Listen, they're
None.
under the ownership, and I'm not one to blame James Dolan like a lot of other people do, right?
Exactly.
Because as an owner, you want an owner to invest money in it, right? If you look at the Mets People criticize the baseball team Mets because their owners don't put money in. They say they're cheap because they're so used to the George Steinbrenner Yankees was spelled. So you can't accuse James Dolan of being cheap. He is paying so many people who are not even associated with this
And
organization.
let me say this too.
You might as well go into the Mets right there, guys.
But in his last thing, ever since he's owned the club, he has had now, counting Mike Miller, 13 different head coaches. 13. Wow. And that is unheard of.
It is.
That is so much instability in an organization.
Sounds familiar.
But what's interesting, and we don't want to. I know our viewers want to move on, and Fatima wants to move on. But let's just say this: in the same building, under the same ownership, you have the New York Rangers hockey team who've had success.
Yes.
And I argue that point, and people say, well, he's more involved with the Knicks. But he said because people kept criticizing him for being too hands-on, he hired Phil Jackson and said, you know what, I'm stepping back. I'm going to be hands-off, and I'm going to let the basketball people run the operations, which he did. And so now people are criticizing him for that. So, again, I'm not defending James Dolan, but a lot of times it's damn if you do, damn if you don't.
Right.
But as Bobby pointed out, there's no denying under his ownership, the team has not been successful and has been one of the worst franchises record-wise and from a standpoint of instability in basketball. But if we look at it globally, they have one of the highest valuations of any sports franchise in the world with all the losing. And we're talking about Madison Square Garden Knicks in general. And the only friend are the Yankees and soccer teams, which, of course, make a fortune. Man U. So they're not hurting financially by any means.
Potential guys, our time is running. Potential coaches. We hear the Mark Jackson again. What do you think, guys?
So, we hear Mark Jackson. So the names that we hear, right? Mark Jackson, Jeff Van Gundy, even Becky Hammonds, will they pull the trigger to have the first female coach out there?
She's an assistant for the San Antonio Spurs.
Wow. The thing about Mark Jackson, right? Everyone's talking about, look what he did with Golden State. Again, it comes down to you need to have talent. When he was in Golden State, he had a young Steph Curry. He had a young Klay Thompson. These were stars. He had a veteran, Monte Ellis, who was one of the top 5 scorers back then. He had Harrison Barnes, another young guy. And he had David Lee, former Knicks. So he had talent. They were young, but they had talent. The jury is still out as to whether the Knicks have young. No one knows whether they have talent out there. So I don't know how effective Mark Jackson would be with this roster, and that holds true for anyone. Now, the argument for Jeff Van Gundy is Jeff Van Gundy has reinvented himself because he has coached the junior team for the United States, and they've had success on the world stage. And the story with Jeff Van Gundy is he beats himself up because he quit the job that he liked because he couldn't deal with the politics that was going on, the infighting he was having with the general manager at the time, Ernie Grunfeld. And he's admitted it was one of the worst career decisions he ever made. So to close the books, I think he really would like to come back. I think he's going to be the lead candidate moving forward.
Interesting. Now the Mets. The Mets look like they're going to, if they didn't pull the trigger, they're going to sell their team. They seem like they never really rebounded from that Ponzi scheme.
Bernie Madoff.
The Ponzi,
While they denied really being significantly impacted by it, I think they were, the Mets owners, Fred Wilpon, they were part of the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme.
They were investors.
Yes, and lost so much money. So a billionaire hedge fund manager, Steve Cohen, he's been a minority owner, but now he's going to buy a majority stake in the team, and I think the Mets certainly will benefit by his majority ownership because again the Mets aren't far off and they're not a very difficult fix. A couple of moves and the Mets could be right there back in contention. So I think and I know Met fans, everyone is tweeting me or rather and texting me. It's like they're in their glory because they want ownership out. But if we look at New York sports, you have the Giants, whose head coach Pat Shermer, it's a good chance he will be out after only 2 seasons. The general manager who hired him, Dave Gettleman, He's now completing his second season with the team, and he may only have one more year. And so there's instability with so many of the New York franchises.
Who's the starting quarterback for the New York
Eli.
Giants?
My quarterback is back
will be
tomorrow.
back
Eli
tomorrow.
Manning.
Eli Manning.
So I know we're wrapping out.
My
Just one other quick story out there, and this happened in San Francisco. So one of the San Francisco 49ers, a football team, Tim Ryan, former NFL player, he does commentary for him. He went on a talk show, and the Baltimore Ravens is one of the better teams this year. They have a young quarterback, Lamar Jackson, who was just changing the whole dynamics.
Black quarterback. And there were people when he was being drafted who said he shouldn't be a quarterback, he should be a wide receiver. He's proven to be a very good quarterback. Anyway. No. He's going to be the MVP of the league this year, most valuable player.
So they recently played San Francisco. They beat San Francisco. So he's on talk shows, Tim Ryan, and he's the question to him was, what makes Lamar Jackson so effective? And he said, well, his speed, but also the dark jersey they wear in the ball fakes. So why is he effective? He's a good ball faker because of the dark jersey they have on, the color of the ball, and the color of his skin. And because he's able to hide the ball. So he got suspended for making that comment. The players on San Francisco, including Richard Sherman, came to his defense and said that they didn't take that as a racist statement. They understand why people would see it insensitive, but they back him in what he was saying out there.
And so did you.
Yeah.
I did.
Bobby Childs.
Listen,
Bobby Childs said
He left that part out.
Exactly.
Right. If you look at the pictures, of him, his dark jersey, his dark hands, his big hands, and the ball. It's kind of hard to see the ball.
Yeah,
It's kind of hard to see the ball. That's all
let
I'm
me just
saying.
make this point. It was a Jimmy the Greek moment, and if we remember when Jimmy the Greek, but what Jimmy the Greek said was historically correct. He said because slave owners, they bred the big black slaves with the women they thought were physically strong. So Jimmy the Greek, what he was saying was historically, it was a fact, but it was insensitive and politically incorrect.
But even Reverend Sharpton said that Jimmy the Greek shouldn't have been fired for that. Maybe reprimanded, but not fired for that. Real quick, guys, I really got to wrap up, but I got to throw one more at you. So there have been over 283,000 signed petitions to remove Michael Vick as honorary Pro Bowl captain. Wow. Let's talk about that real quick. A lot of people say that. I saw Colette Smith, the first African-American female coach for the New York Jets, put out there that there are so many more established people than picking Michael Vick to be this honorary Pro Bowl captain. My thing is, I can agree with you, Colette, on that hand. I'm not going to say you're wrong, but if Michael Vick has done his time, I just think that the NFL and other folks have not treated this man fairly.
And if people remember, Michael Vick went to jail for almost 2 years, federal prison for his part in breeding and fighting and the abuse of pit bulls, dogs.
Right.
And so, the brother was ostracized, he was scrutinized, he was vilified, he did his time. And what you want to see is true contrition. And since that time, he has gone out. He's been, animal rights advocates. He's done all the right things. He said all the right things. And we're talking about, now 15 years. So he's been consistent from that time. And so I do think that, he's someone who, when we talk about second chances, he's earned it. He deserves it. And I have absolutely no problems with it. I understand how people would feel on have an opposing view. But I just think that he is someone who has earned it and shown that he has done everything to be contrite and to not only say it, but do it in action.
Yeah, all right. Bobby, do you have any upcoming protests or my brother? Because you make it happen, man. So I don't want to go without.
Do we have any? Well, tomorrow we'll have our 195th Justice Monday protest against police brutality in front of the federal building, 970 Broad Street in Newark, New Jersey, corner Broad and Walnut, from 4:30 to 6. We're there every Monday to protest police brutality. But I do want to mention quickly, this was a Black History Week, even though it wasn't Black History Month. December 1st, Rosa Parks gets arrested for refusing to give up her seat. December 5th, the Montgomery bus boycott started. December 2nd was the anniversary of the hanging of John Brown. December 3rd, Frederick Douglass starts publishing the North Star newspaper. December 5th was the murder of Fred Hampton.
Yes.
And December 6th, is the anniversary of the passage of the 13th Amendment, which I don't know why there's not a national holiday for. That is not Juneteenth.
Right.
December 6th, the passage of the 13th Amendment is when slavery officially ends in the United States of America.
Civil rights would have probably been different if Fred Hampton would have lived with the Panthers, with New York City Black Panthers also, and also the West Coast Panthers.
Right.
And they would have came
Right.
together. Then,
Right.
of course, Elaine Brown there. You know, it's just a lot there.
Right.
I think civil rights and civil rights organizations
Right.
would have been
We
different.
talk about Amadou Diallo and 41 shots. They fired over 1,000 rounds into that apartment where
Was
Fred
his girlfriend
Hampton.
killed?
Was
She was
girlfriend.
was she killed?
No, remember
No,
Fred
she
Hampton
lived.
Jr. She was pregnant.
She was pregnant. She
was
lived.
pregnant with Fred Hampton Jr.
And they had been infiltrated by a black
Yeah.
undercover officer who is suspected of spiking the Kool-Aid so that they couldn't have gotten themselves together to escape.
Wow.
Wow.
All right,
Yeah, it's
fellas
a true
and
story.
lady.
I didn't know that part
it's
of
true
that
story.
story.
I was
Yes,
gonna say
sir.
Amber. I'm sorry. Any appearances coming up?
Not that I know of, because it's always kind of last minute, so nothing that I know of yet. But can I just read a quick stat about something that I pulled up because I mentioned it? The cops that the info
long
that came
is it?
out
We
about
gotta
that.
end it
Really
up.
quick. So about that. So it's 3 cops and a sergeant that brought a discrimination suit against the NYPD. So they said that cops who arrested black men were rewarded with more overtime, and black. Hold on, let me scroll down real quick. Black and Hispanic cops in general were punished more severely for failing to meet the quotas. The supervisor would place minority officers in punishment posts, denying vacation, denying overtime, changing their shifts, giving them discipline, yelling at them, and giving them poor evaluations.
Gotcha. Thank
And Bettina, I
you.
know
wanted
just
to
you
throw
have to
that in
speak
there.
about and moving forward, new NYPD police commissioner.
Not only the new commissioner, and his first move was to promote a good friend of us, Rodney Harrison, the chief of detectives.
Yes,
Chief of
yes,
detectives.
yes, yes,
Chief of
yes.
detectives.
Ronnie's a
So
good
I
brother.
gotta call him. Matter of fact,
My niece and his daughter play AAU basketball together.
Oh,
so
they play. They have daughters that play ball. Yeah,
Yes,
Shout out
yes.
to the Harrison family. Laprina is his wife.
My niece.
Let me just
Sky
say
Owen.
this in my words. Remember, the greatest tragedy in life is not death, but rather living without purpose. Without purpose, life has no meaning, no significance, no hope. It's activity without direction, events without reason, just pointless. And most of all, life becomes motion without any true meaning. So live your life to the fullest, a life of purpose and meaning. Bobby Childs.
As
Wait.
Bob,
Shout out to our production team for the great job they did on the graphics today. I saw
Yes.
more graphics coming across that screen.
Tazo.
right.
Robin's back there.
That's right. Oh, let me
Robin
just say
is
this. I got to say this. That there's some changes that are happening with Hot 97 and WBLS. Got a chance to talk to the head of digital. Matter of fact, the company is hiring more folks to come into digital to take it to the next level. And one of the things that they have said is that OpenLine online has been one of the most, if not the most consistent program on their digital platform
Wow.
Thank you.
here at
So
the
thank you
broadcast.
guys for watching.
There you
Thank
go.
you all.
Bobby Childs.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
And as the great, wise Bob Slade told us all, get your mind right and keep a good thought. Thanks for tuning in this week.
And we'll see all of you next week. God
And they
bless.
didn't hear
And
you
then
'cause
hear a
weren't
word
on the
you
mic.
said, Bob Pickett.
Yeah,
You're
Mike.
not
See
on the
that?
mic.
See you next week.
See you next week.
See you next week.